Okay, this is an excerpt from Living with Kundalini by Gopi Krishna. Introduction: The Awakening of Kundalini. One morning during the Christmas of 1937, I sat cross-legged in a small room in a little house on the outskirts of the town of Jammu, the winter capital of Jammu and Kashmir state in northern India. I was meditating with my face towards the window on the east through which the first grey streaks of the slowly brightening dawn fell into the room. Long practice had accustomed me to sit in the same posture for hours at a time without the least discomfort, and I sat, breathing slowly and rhythmically, my attention drawn towards the crown of my head, contemplating an imaginary lotus in full bloom, radiating light. I sat steadily, unmoving and erect, my thoughts uninterruptedly centered on the shining lotus, intent on keeping my attention from wandering and bringing it back again and again whenever it moved into another direction. The intensity of concentration interrupted my breathing. Gradually, it slowed down to such an extent that at times it was barely perceptible. My whole being was so engrossed in the contemplation of the lotus that for several minutes at a time I lost touch with my body and surroundings. During such intervals, I used to feel as if I were poised in midair without any feeling of a body around me. The only object of which I was aware was a lotus of brilliant color, emitting rays of light. This experience has happened to many people who practice meditation in any form regularly for a sufficient length of time. But what followed on that faithful morning in my case, changing the whole course of my life and outlook, has happened to few. During one such spell of intense concentration, I suddenly felt a strange sensation below the base of the spine, at the place touching the seat, while I sat cross-legged on a folded blanket spread on the floor. The sensation was so extraordinary and so pleasing that my attention was forcibly drawn towards it. The moment my attention was thus unexpectedly withdrawn from the point on which it was focused, the sensation ceased. Thinking it to be a trick played by my imagination, to relax attention, I dismissed the matter from my mind and brought my attention back to the point from which it had wandered. Again, I fixed it on the lotus, and as the image grew clear and distinct at the top of my head, again the sensation occurred. This time I tried to maintain the fixity of my attention and succeeded for a few seconds, but the sensation, extending upwards, grew so intense and was so extraordinary as compared to anything I had experienced before, that in spite of myself, my mind went towards it, and at that very moment it again disappeared. I was now convinced that something unusual had happened for which my daily practice of concentration was probably responsible. I had read glowing accounts written by learned men of great benefits resulting from concentration and of the miraculous powers acquired by yogis through such exercises. My heart began to beat wildly, and I found it difficult to bring my attention to the required degree of fixity. After a while, I grew composed and was soon as deep in meditation as before. When completely immersed, I again experienced the sensation, but this time, instead of allowing my mind to leave the point where I had fixed it, I maintained a rigidity of attention throughout. The sensation again extended upwards, growing in intensity, and I felt myself wavering, but with great effort I kept my attention centered around the lotus. Suddenly, with a roar like that of a waterfall, I felt a stream of liquid light entering my brain through the spinal cord. Entirely unprepared for such a development, I was completely taken by surprise, but regaining self-control instantaneously, I remained sitting in the same posture, keeping my mind on the point of concentration. The illumination grew brighter and brighter, the roaring louder. I experienced a rocking sensation and then felt myself slipping out of my body, entirely enveloped in a halo of light. it is impossible to describe the experience accurately. I felt the point of consciousness that was myself growing wider, surrounded by waves of light. It grew wider and wider, spreading outwards, while the body, normally the immediate object of its perception, appeared to have receded into the distance until I became entirely unconscious of it. I was now all consciousness, without any outline, without any idea of a corporeal appendage, without any feeling or sensation coming from the senses, immersed in a sea of light, simultaneously conscious and aware of every point, spread out, as it were, in all direction without any barrier or material obstruction. I was no longer myself, or to be more accurate, no longer as I knew myself to be, a small point of awareness confined in a body, but instead I was a vast circle of consciousness in which the body was but a point, bathed in light and in a state of exaltation and happiness impossible to describe. After some point, the duration of which I could not judge, the circle began to narrow down. I felt myself contracting, becoming smaller and smaller, until I again became dimly conscious of the outline of my body. Then, more clearly, and as I slipped back to my normal condition, I became suddenly aware of the noises in the street, felt again my arms and legs and head, and once more became my narrow self in touch with my body and surroundings. When I opened my eyes and looked about, I felt a little dazed and bewildered, as if coming back from a strange and completely foreign to me, as if coming back from a strange land completely foreign to me. The sun had risen and was shining full on my face, warm and soothing. I tried to lift my hands, which always rested on my lap, one upon the other during meditation. My arms felt limp and lifeless. With an effort, I raised them up and stretched them to enable the blood to flow freely. Then I tried to free my legs from the posture in which I was sitting and to place them on a more comfortable position, but could not. They were heavy and stiff. With the help of my hands, I freed them and stretched them out, and then put my back against the wall, reaching in a position of ease and comfort. What had happened to me? Was I the victim of an hallucination? Or had I, by some strange vagary of fate, succeeded where millions of others had failed? Was there, after all, really some truth to the oft-repeated claim of the sages and ascetics of India, made for thousands of years and verified and repeated generation after generation, that it was possible to apprehend transcendental reality in this life if one followed certain rules of conduct and practiced meditation in a certain way? My thoughts were in a daze. I could hardly believe that I had experienced a vision of divinity. There had been an expansion of my own self, my own consciousness, and the transformation had been brought about by the vital current that had started from below the spine and found access to my brain through the backbone. I recalled that I had read long ago in books on yoga of a certain vital mechanism called Kundalini, connected with the lower end of the spine, which becomes active by means of certain exercises, and when once roused, carries a limited human consciousness to transcendental heights, endowing the individual with incredible psychic and mental powers. Had I been lucky enough to find the key to this wonderful mechanism, which was wrapped up in the legendary mist of ages about which people talked and whispered without having once seen it in action in themselves or in others? I tried once again to repeat the experience, but was so weak and flabbergasted that I could not collect my thoughts sufficiently to induce a state of concentration. My mind was in a ferment. I looked at the sun. Could it be that in my condition of extreme concentration I had mistaken it for the effulgent halo that had surrounded me in the superconscious state? I closed my eyes again, allowing the rays of sun to play upon my face. No, the glow that I could perceive across my closed eyelids were quite different. It was external and had not that splendor. The light I had experienced was internal, an integral part of enlarged consciousness, a part of myself. I stood up. My legs felt weak and tottered under me. It seemed as if my vitality had been drained out. My arms were no better. I massaged my thighs and legs gently, and, feeling a little better, slowly walked downstairs. Saying nothing to my wife, I took my meal in silence and left for work. My appetite was not as keen as usual. My mouth appeared dry, and I could not put my thoughts into my work in the office. I was in a state of exhaustion and lassitude, disinclined to talk. After a while, feeling suffocated and ill at ease, I left for a short walk in the street with the idea of finding diversion for my thoughts. My mind reverted again and again to the experience of the morning, trying to recreate in imagination the marvelous phenomenon I had witnessed, but without success. My body, especially the legs, still felt weak, and I could not walk for long. I took no interest in the people whom I met, and walked with a sense of detachment and indifference to my surroundings, quite foreign to me. I returned to my desk sooner than I had intended, and passed the remaining hours toying with pen and paper, unable to compose my thoughts sufficiently to work. When I returned home in the afternoon, I felt no better. I could not bring myself to sit down and read, my usual habit in the evening. I ate supper in silence, without appetite or relish, and retired to bed. Usually I was asleep within minutes of putting my head to the pillow, but this night I felt strangely restless and disturbed. I could not reconcile the exaltation of the morning with the depression that sat heavily on me while I tossed from side to side on the bed. I had an unaccountable feeling of fear and uncertainty. At last, in the midst of misgivings, I fell asleep. I slept fitfully, dreaming strange dreams, and woke up after short intervals in sharp contrast with my usual deep, uninterrupted sleep. After about 3 a.m., sleep refused to come. I sat up in bed for some time. Sleep had not refreshed me. I still felt fatigued, and my thoughts lacked clarity. The usual time for my meditation was approaching. I decided to begin earlier so that I would not have the sun on my hands and face, and without disturbing my wife, went upstairs to my study. I spread the blankets and, sitting cross-legged as usual, began to meditate. I could not concentrate with the same intensity on the previous day, though I tried my best. My thoughts wandered, and instead of being in a state of happy expectancy, I felt strangely nervous and uneasy. At last, after repeated efforts, I held my attention at the usual point for some time, waiting for results. Nothing happened, and I began to feel doubts about the validity of my previous experience. I tried again, this time with better success. Pulling myself together, I steadied my wandering thoughts and, fixing my attention on the crown, tried to visualize a lotus in full bloom, as was my custom. As soon as I arrived at the usual pitch of mental fixity, I again felt the current moving upwards. I did not allow my attention to waver, and again, with a rush and a roaring noise in my ears, the stream of effulgent light entered my brain, filling me with power and vitality. And I felt myself expanding in all directions, spreading beyond the boundaries of flesh, entirely absorbed in the contemplation of a brilliant conscious glow, at one with it, and yet not entirely merged with it. The condition lasted for a shorter duration than it had done the day before. The feeling of exaltation was not so strong. When I came back to normal, I felt my heart thumping wildly, and there was a bitter taste in my mouth. It seemed as if a scorching blast of hot air had passed through my body. The feeling of exhaustion and weariness was more pronounced than it had been yesterday. I rested for some time to recover my strength and poise. It was still dark. I had now no doubts that the experience was real and that the sun had nothing to do with the internal luster that I sow. But why did I feel uneasy and depressed, instead of feeling exceedingly happy at my luck and blessing my stars? Why had despondency overtaken me? I felt as if I were in imminent danger of something beyond my understanding and power, something intangible and mysterious, which I could neither grasp nor analyze. A heavy cloud of depression and gloom seemed to hang around me, rising from my own internal depth without relation to external circumstances. I did not feel I was the same man I had been but a few days before, and a condition of horror on account of the inexplicable change began to settle on me, from which, try as I might, I could not make myself free by any effort of my will. Little did I realize that from that day onwards, I was never to be my old normal self again, that I had unwittingly and without preparation or even adequate knowledge of it aroused to activity the most wonderful and stern power in man, that I had stepped unknowingly upon the key to the most guarded secret of the ancients, and that thenceforth for a long time I had to live suspended by a thread, swinging between life on the one hand and death on the other, between sanity and insanity, between light and darkness, between heaven and earth. The link of this archive, Living with Kundalini, Gopi Krishna, can be found in the description below. So that's a great account of Kundalini awakening. I hope you enjoyed it.